So today we're actually starting off in this new series called Not a Fan. And it's actually going to be really cool. It's going to be 7 weeks of like talking about what this means and unpacking that. But first, I want to talk about me and my wife. Me and my wife. That's Casey, everybody. That's my wife. She always loves when I talk about her. She just loves like every second of it, as you can tell by her face right now. Picking her nails, that's a sign of security. Like all those things. Those are good things. But so before my wife and I started dating, most people feared this talk that most couples would have. You know, you're talking to somebody, you're hanging out with somebody, and you know, before like you awkwardly are starting to like date, there's this moment where you have to have this certain conversation where you have to talk about, okay, what are we actually doing here? And they called it the DTR. Anybody know what that stands for? Define the relationship. If you were born 10 years ago, you would definitely know what that was because it was a huge thing. People would say this so much of the time. I remember people always having the DTR, the DTR, DTR. And I remember for a long time, I was like, what's the DTR? And like, you got to define the relationship. And I was like, oh, that's what everyone's doing. Everyone's doing it way too much. And so it was such a hot word around people who were dating around that time. And in fact, in Casey's dorm room, there used to be this bench that was outside there, and she was telling me about how when people would go to this bench, they like nicknamed it the DTR bench. Like that's where people went to go have the DTR, the talk, the like defining the relationship. And I'm guessing the way that it worked out was, you know, you went to some event on campus, you were hanging out with all your friends, and then the guy walks the girl back to her dorm room, and he's like, listen, we're hanging out, you know, we're one-on-one talking and stuff. Like, what does this mean? You know, hey, let's sit down at this bench before I walk you right to the door, and let's have a little talk. And they were weirdos, and they would stay out their window and just watch these conversations go on. And so you would have this talk, you would sit down and you would define the relationship. You know, you'd probably ask questions like, where is this going? Like, are we more than just friends? I mean, are we boyfriend and girlfriend exclusive? Are you just talking to me? Are you talking to other people? And most times it would go as planned, but then there's always those moments where those two people aren't on the same page. And I'm pretty sure those were probably the best ones because it's like, oh, we're not the way that I thought we were. Sometimes two people would just not be on the same page where one person's not feeling the same way as the other person, or you have one person who looks at the other person and says, well, I admire you. And you're like, wait a second, what does that mean? Like, what's going on? And so I say that because fast forward a few years later, I want to introduce you to these two kids. That's young Casey at 19 years old, and that's young Stephen at 45 years old. So we had an interesting relationship. But these two kids started hanging out. Do you guys like that picture? I feel like no one even laughed at that picture. That's such a good, man, that was, no. That was 10 years ago. That was 45. So these two kids are just hanging out, just being friends, and then things start to change a little bit. We start to hang out a little bit more, and I'm these ideas. I'm like, okay, I think she kind of likes me because, I mean, I'm calling her and she's calling me, and then she's calling me again. Like, I'm just laying it on thick. And so I'm like, okay, I think this girl might like me kind of like I like her, because who else would hang out with this guy Nara for like 6 hours straight? Nobody. So like I'm like, okay, I think I'm in on this one. And so I'm thinking of all this stuff, and then so it gets into my head that I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure that she 80% sure that she feels 70% sure that she feels the same way, because these are the conversations that guys have. We might get some clear signals, like, I don't know, man. I got to take a chance. I got to do some recon over here. I got to figure out what's going on. And so I was like, okay, I'm telling my friends this. We're all hanging out, and you know, we're hanging out one-on-one and stuff. So I'm talking to my friends, and I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to do it. They're like, what? I'm like, I think I'm going to have that DTR. I got to define. I got to figure out where we're at. And so I'm like, okay, I got to be clear about this. I got to be straightforward. I got to get to the point. I got to let her know how I feel. I got to do all these things right up front so that way there's no questions and I leave confident. And so we meet up and we're hanging out, and then we go to some friends' houses and we're all hanging out together now. And then now it's time to take her home. So I'm like, okay, this is the time. Man, my mic. On the way home, I'm gonna stop, and so we stop at this playground, and we're kind of sitting there, and I'm like, okay, this is it. I got to be straightforward. I got to be clear. I got to be, honest about how I feel. And so I look at her, and again, I'm thinking, be clear, be straightforward, to the point, how I feel. And I felt like I just could not get any more clear than what I said to her. I said, so, like, how do you view me? And she goes, well, I admire you. Thank you. I couldn't have been more clear about my feelings. I couldn't have been more clear about how I felt. I couldn't have been more clear about where I was in this relationship. And she comes back with, I admire you? No. And so I do what any normal, sane person would do, and I get mad at her. And I say, well, you need to be careful about how you spend your one-on-one time, Missy. Like, you're just leading people on here. In fact, you better walk home. And I leave. No, I didn't do that. I had some of those parts, but I didn't quite yell at her, and I didn't just leave her in the park. I didn't say go home. But I remember that night of like dropping her off and just being so defeated and be like, man, I'm here, so straightforward. I was to the point of how I felt. And she just said, but I admire you. And I was like, dirty. And so I remember that night getting a text from my friends, and they're like, how'd it go? And I remember this so specifically of what I said. And I said, no go. I think I'm just going to go to bed, sad face. And so like that's where I left the night, so defeated. And little did I know, though, that Casey was having another conversation as she got home with her sister-in-law, talking about how big of a jerk I was, like who says that to somebody, like all these things. But then our knight in shining armor, her brother comes in. He's like, wait, what happened? What did he say to you? And so Casey gives him the whole story again. And he's just like, oh, he was so clear in what he was trying to say. He likes you. And she's like, wait, what? He goes, yeah, he's telling you he likes you. Because everybody knows when someone asks, what do you think of me? They're saying, I like you. Again, I was straightforward, clear, to the point. Luckily, everything worked out because obviously we're married and we have 2 kids, and we figured it out, but it was hard. I was so angry the next time I had to see her or talk to her. And so here's this poor guy, me, sitting by himself, thinking back of like, just in my car, of like, man, she admires me? Like, that's it? But the thing is, like, don't we all where we stand in relationships? Don't we all kind of want to know where we sit with people, whether it's our parents, whether it's our siblings, whether it's friends, whether it's someone we like? We want to know how that other person feels about us, and we kind of want them to know if it's good, like how we feel about them. I mean, this is why we do recon, right? This is why we send friends to say like, hey, go talk to that person for me. Figure out what she like. Is she likes anybody? Like she like me? Like what's going on? Where's she at with that? Like we do that. We send people to go do. We send people to go do our dirty work sometimes, and sometimes it's like, okay, now I'm going to be the bigger person, and I'm going to do my own dirty work, and I'm actually going to do these hard things. I'm going to have these conversations. I'm going to have the DTR myself. And so we want to know where we stand with people. We want to know, how do we define the relationship? But here's the real question that I want us to ask ourselves. Here's the real question of the kind of the heart of this series is that, have you ever had this conversation with God? Have you ever had this conversation with God where we're going through this thing, not a fan, but have you ever defined relationship with God? I mean, where do you sit with him? Where does he sit with you? I mean, we're all sitting here listening for a reason, but what is behind that? I mean, when we look at this, like, are we here just checking things out? Okay, if we're checking things out, then we kind of know where the relationship is. We kind of had that DTR a little bit. It's like, okay, where I'm at with God is I'm just checking things out. We're just kind of friends. He's a far person, and I'm far from him, and he's far from me. But I'm checking things out. Maybe you're just hanging out with God, and if you're hanging out with God, what does that mean? How do you define that relationship? Or maybe you just really admire God. Stupid. What does that mean? When you really admire God, define your relationship. What does that actually look like? What does it mean that you admire God? And to take it a step further, this is where most of us might be, is that we might even say that we're a Christian. And now we're actually getting somewhere. Now we're moving closer to a clear definition of what relationship is. But when we say that we're a Christian, sometimes we want to qualify what that actually means. Because if someone were to ever ask you, hey, are you a Christian? How would you actually answer that? Some of us might say, no, but I might be spiritual. Hey, are you a Christian? Some of us might say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but what do you mean when you say Christian? Or some of us might say, hey, are you a Christian? And be like, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like those Christians over there. And so we have to qualify that answer of what it actually means to be a Christian. Some of us have had this relationship, this title that's so loaded with questions. Yeah, you're a Christian, but what does that mean? How do you define that relationship? You say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm a Christian because I was born in the church, and I've always just been a Christian. I'm a Christian because I was baptized. I'm a Christian because I was just told I was a Christian. Or I'm a Christian because I prayed a prayer, and then I prayed it later on in life just to be sure that I was a Christian. See, there's all these things. There's all these questions that we have to come into this label of what it actually means to be a Christian. And sometimes people get caught up in this idea of what it means to be a Christian and say, listen, a Christian is about how you behave. To be a Christian, you have to behave this way. You have to look that way. And for other people, they say, no, like to be a Christian, it's all about what you believe. What is it that you know? And how do you behave? So there's like these thoughts of like, okay, to be a Christian, it's all about believing, behaving. And people get caught in that. And some just hate the idea of Christian. Some people want to go as far away from that label, and that's why we have, no, I'm not a Christian, but I believe in this, or I honor that, or I lift this up. Because Christian can be one of those things that we hold over other people's heads who don't believe the same things that we believe. You might know some of these people who say like, man, look at those people and how bad they are. I don't do those things because I go to church and because I'm a Christian. And they have an attitude like, I'm just a little bit better than you because I do these acts. But here's the crazy thing, and here's the reason why people can do that. Because Christian has never actually been defined. There's no clear definition of what a Christian is inside of the Bible. And that sounds crazy. Because like Christian, that's what people do. Like people who read their Bibles, those are probably Christians. But yet, you don't find Christian defined in the Bible. In fact, you only find the word Christian 3 times. There's only that word Christian 3 times in our entire Bible. And 2 of those 3 times it's used by outsiders calling those who follow Jesus Christians. So it's like almost this like nickname, this like oh, that guy's a nerd, or that guy's a geek, or that guy's like a jock. It's like saying that to somebody like that's not what we call ourselves, though. It's like, yeah, but that's an outsider giving a name to someone on the inside. 2 out of the 3 times it's an outsider describing someone who has followed Jesus. And for me, it's so interesting that we use this label that the first century Jesus followers didn't call themselves. They didn't label themselves as Christians. And so if they didn't call themselves Christians, what did they call themselves? And the crazy thing is that you see this all over the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, over and over and over again. It's this word disciple. That these early first century Jesus followers didn't call themselves Christians, but they called themselves disciple. Acts 11:26, it says, So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And again, this word Christian was like the government at the time was looking at all these people gathering in one place, and they didn't know what to call them. Because usually you can look at a group of people and say, oh, they're the Greeks, they're the Jews, they're those people over there, they're the poor, they're the rich. And that's how they would label people. But like when they came to these people, it crossed boundaries all over the place. It's like, these just aren't rich people. These just aren't poor people. These just aren't Greeks. These just aren't Jews. They're a mixture of people. What do we call them? And they called them Christians. Acts 6:7, it says, so the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and the large number of priests became obedient to the faith. And I always love this one because this is about Paul trying to join. This again, Paul is the guy who hated Christians, ultimately to become a Christian, and he's trying to join this group. He's trying to join this movement that's happening, but like he has this whole history of like killing Christians, of bringing them into for jail, and so like people are like, I don't trust you, and so he's trying to join this movement. He says, when he came to Jerusalem, meaning Paul, he tried to join the disciples. He tried to join the church. He tried to join these people, but they were afraid of him. Again, would you be afraid if this guy said, hey, I sent your dad to prison? Like, well, I don't know. But they were afraid of him, not believing that he was really a disciple. So again, over and over, we see this thing, disciple, disciple, disciple. And here's the thing about being a Christian, or here's the thing about being a disciple, is that you can hide behind the word Christian all day. You can hide behind the word Christian all day because you can make it look however you want. And we know this. We know that people will call themselves Christians and do a whole bunch of unchristian things. But when it comes to this one is one that's so clearly defined in Scripture that you can't hide behind it. This one should almost be scary because it's really defining the relationship now. Because it's really getting specific. This is where you say, okay, God, I'm looking at you and I see what you've done. And this is now where I give you permission to start to interact. Just going to hide behind this word Christian anymore, but I want to be your disciple. I want to be your follower. I want to say, listen, I'm not just going to say I'm a Christian and do whatever I want, these bad because I feel like it, but now I'm going to say I'm a disciple and you can interrupt my life. You can do as you need to be, the things that need to be done. I'm not going to do things the way that I've always done them, but now I'm going to look to you. I'm not just going to say I admire you, that you have a lot of good stuff, but those things that you say to do, I want to do. And it comes down to these questions of like, okay, God, like, okay, I want to be a disciple. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to be more like you. And so when it comes to these things, what would you do? When it comes to doing and acting in certain ways, how would you act? Because that's what I want to do and that's how I want to act. That's what it means to be a disciple, and that's how it interrupts your life. When it comes to these situations, how would you handle them? Because the way that you handle things, that's how I want to handle things. And the way that he handles things will interrupt your life. Because it won't always be easy. It won't always feel good. It'll change. Because we'll have those moments of like, wait, when people hate you, when people dislike you, you want me to love them even more? That doesn't make sense. That's really what you would do, God. For those people who hate you, you would love them even more. You want me to pray for those people. All right. If that's what you do, well, that's what I do. It'll start to interrupt your life. And really the heart of this series, again, is asking that question like, not a fan. Not being a fan. Where's it at? There you go. Not a fan. We want to have this chemistry of not just being a fan, but being something more. We want to start the conversation of asking ourselves, where do we sit with God? What does that relationship look like? Where do we actually say like, okay, this is how God interacts with my life. This is how I interact with God. It's like I just don't want to be a fan, but I want to be more than that. And these are the questions that we're asking, is that not just being a fan, but being a disciple. Are we disciples or are we just Christians? Again, are we asking those questions of like, okay, God, what would you do in this situation? Okay, that's what I want to do. Or Christian is like, okay, I'm just going to say I'm a Christian, do lip service, and just continue to do whatever it is that I want. Or we can put it a different way. Are we Jesus followers or fans? Are we Jesus followers or fans? And fans are, you can think about it like this, they're like enthusiastic admirers. Nothing really costs them anything to attend. Fans want to be close enough to the action to get all the benefits, but they want none of the sacrifice. They want to be close enough to the action, but they want none of the sacrifice. They don't want to put themselves in there. They might, they're not willing to be interrupted by what God has to say, but they want to admire from a distance. They want to admire God from a distance and say, okay, yeah, this looks really, really nice. And I want to be a part of that, but I don't want to do all the stuff. Like when people hate me, I kind of want to hate them back. I don't want to love them as much as, God says to love them, but it looks nice to say that. But I'm not going to do that. That's what a fan is. They're enthusiastic admirers, but they want to be close to the action, but they don't want to sacrifice. They don't want to be interrupted. And I love what Jesus has to say to his disciples. He says, "A new commandment I give to you. Love one another as I have loved you. You so love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." I mean, looking at this, what is the mark of a Jesus follower? And the mark of a Jesus follower really is the same, the line that you cross from just being fan. It's that you would just love one another, but not the way that you would love. Because again, when we would love, we would say, listen, those people who don't love us, yeah, we'll dust them off. I don't want anything to do with them. But Jesus says, listen, love one another as I have loved you. And to know how Jesus has loved you requires some intimacy. It means that you have to have this relationship that's closer than just from a distance. Because if you're not close to somebody, you just know facts about them. You don't actually know them. Sometimes we look at Christianity and we're like, okay, what Jesus did, it was a lot of serving and it was a lot of giving. So I'm just going to serve and I'm just going to give. That's what it means to be a Christian. But to really know Jesus means that loving and serving have a different definition. Because you just don't do that to the people that you like. You do that to everyone, even those who look and act nothing like you. When we were horrible people to God, when we turned our backs on him over and over, when we chose ourselves rather than to serve him, he still sought after us. He just doesn't look at us as, oh, you want to go that way? Well, all right, I'll take my stuff and go. No, Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says, I'm continuing to go after you. Even when you run further and further, I'm not leaving. Even when you spit in my face, even when you nail me to a cross, I'm still going to serve you and give to you. He doesn't stop. So this question, are you a disciple or just a Christian? Are you a Jesus follower or just a fan? Think about that. Think about the bench outside of Casey's door. Like, okay, if I'm walking with God and then we happen to sit at that bench, what's that conversation going to be like? When we sit down and he looks at me and I look at him, what are the things that I'm going to say to him? When we sit at that swing set or when we sit at that coffee shop or when we sit at wherever it might be and we're thinking about, okay, how do I feel about the person across from me? What will I say and what will he say? And the crazy thing is, if we embrace this idea of really being a disciple over a Christian, if we really embrace this idea of being a Jesus follower, a fan, the world around us would look different. Your world would look different. I mean, you think about it, and you would have these, like, the racial tensions would be so much less. Widows and orphans and families would be taken care of more. Place where you would see that, like, your doubt would be welcomed. You would see that this place where your failures wouldn't be shamed, but they would be brought in and be like, okay, well, let's work on this. You're still loved even though you failed. You would truly see heaven start to come down to earth if people chose to be not just Christians, not just fans, but actual Jesus followers, actual disciples. And this idea of bringing heaven down from earth doesn't happen when you're just a Christian, when you just have this title. It comes by taking steps and crossing that line and saying, I'm going to love not how I would love people, but I'm going to love how you loved me. And again, it's asking those questions and seeing that's like, okay, how would you handle this, God? Well, that's how I want to handle it. What would you do in this situation? Well, that's what I want to do. It takes God interrupting your life to be a disciple. It takes intimacy. It takes knowing him and not just knowing stuff about him. But sometimes we aim for intimacy, we end up somewhere else. And the truth is, I think we all want this intimacy, but when we aim for that something else, well, that's what we'll talk about next week. So God, we just love you and we thank you, and we pray that we can stop for a second in our busy schedules, God, of thinking about everything else in the world, and just stop and just ask ourselves that question of like, what would it look like if we sat down and defined our relationship? Would I be more of a fan, or would I be more of a disciple? And just knowing that, God, it's not bad to be just a fan. It's not good just to be a disciple, but just knowing that gets us a little bit closer to you, that we're asking those questions, that we're trying to figure it out. And God, I pray that if we're fans of you, that we would take steps closer to be near you, that we would actually know you and not just know things about you. For disciples, God, I pray that we can stay strong in that idea of asking, what would you do? Because that's what I want to do. Because it's so easy to slip back into being a fan. So we love you, and we thank you, and we praise you for just all the wonderful works that you're doing in our lives, even the ones that we don't see or understand. And we pray all these things in your holy name. Amen.